somewhere between the known world and the edge of everything men dared to imagine, there floated an island that breathed. It did not appear on any map drawn by careful hands. It did not hold still long enough to be charted. Sailors who found it, if they can be said to have found it at all, described white sands, strange vegetation, and an uncanny stillness in the water around it, as though the sea itself had paused to listen. They would drop anchor. They would light fires. They would make camp on what they believed was solid, indifferent earth. And then, when the fires grew hot enough, when the weight of men and wood and ambition became too much to bear, the island moved. It dove. It sank beneath the waves with a slow, deliberate patience, taking everything and everyone down with it into the black. The island was not an island. It was the Aspidochelone. And it had been waiting. The creature appears, with remarkable consistency, across centuries and continents of storytelling, a beast so enormous that its back broke the surface of the sea and was mistaken, by those who did not know better, for dry land. The name itself is Greek in origin, a compound drawn from aspis, meaning shield or rounded arch, and chelone, the ancient word for tortoise. The shield, tortoise. The arched one, a name that tells you exactly what it is, and somehow still manages to feel like a mystery the moment you say it aloud. In the earliest surviving texts, the Aspidochelone appears as a creature of pure theological weight. The Physiologus, that extraordinary compendium of natural history and Christian allegory compiled in Alexandria somewhere around the 2nd or 3rd century, describes the beast with an unsettling calm. It tells us the creature lies motionless on the surface of the water. It tells us that grass and plants grow upon its back, owing to the great spans of time it spends utterly still. And it tells us, plainly and without drama, that sailors are deceived. They mistake it for an island, they come ashore, they light their fires, and they are destroyed. The Physiologus was not, by the standards of its time, a book of horror. It was a book of lessons. The Aspidochelone was there not merely to frighten, but to instruct. The lesson, as the early Christian world understood it, was this: the devil is subtle. Evil does not always announce itself with teeth and fire. Sometimes it presents itself as a resting place. Sometimes it looks like exactly what you need. Solid ground after a long time at sea, warmth, shelter, somewhere finally to stop. The Aspidochelone was the physical embodiment of that deception. You plant your anchor in what you believe is safety. You make yourself comfortable, and by the time you understand what is beneath you, it is already too late. This was a powerful metaphor for a world grappling with the nature of temptation. And because powerful metaphors travel, the creature traveled with it. From Alexandria, the image spread through the Islamic world, through Persian poetry, through Norse saga, through the encyclopedic manuscripts of medieval Europe. Isidore of Seville wrote of it in the 7th century. The great Aberdeen bestiary of the 12th century illustrated it with careful, reverent precision. A vast shape beneath anchored ships, the fires visible on its back. The Norse tradition gave us the half-gufa, a sea monster so colossal it was mapped as geography. The Arabic Book of Animals, composed by Al-Jahiz in 9th century Basra, carries echoes of the same creature in its descriptions of impossible ocean beasts. And then, perhaps most remarkably, Sinbad met it in the 1001 Nights. On the very first of his 7 voyages, Sinbad and his fellow merchants make landfall on what appears to be a lush, verdant island. They cook, they rest, and then the island shudders beneath them, and Sinbad alone survives by clinging to a wooden basin and letting the current carry him to safety. The story is ancient. The creature beneath it is older still. What strikes the careful listener, sitting with all of this, is not the fear these accounts were meant to inspire. It is the consistency. separated by language, by religion, by thousands of miles of ocean and mountain and time. Storytellers across the ancient and medieval world arrived independently at the same image, something enormous, patient, and deceptive, something that wore the face of safety and harbored ruin underneath. That kind of convergence is rarely accidental. In the segments that follow, we will move slowly through the world, the Aspidochelone inhabited, the bestiaries that carried its image from monastery to monastery, the sailors whose very real fears found shape in its form, the theology that made it immortal, and the strange, quiet question that lingers beneath all of it. What does it mean that so many people, across so much history, needed this particular creature to exist? We are in no hurry. The water is calm, and the island is still. There is a particular kind of silence that exists inside a medieval scriptorium. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of concentration, of men bent over slanted desks, their quills moving with small, deliberate strokes across vellum that had been scraped and stretched and prepared for weeks before a single letter ever touched it. The light came in through narrow windows, cold and grey in the winter months, warmer in summer, but never truly generous. Candles supplemented what the sky could not provide, and in that careful, rationed light, across the monasteries of Ireland and England and France and Germany, and the great scriptoria of Constantinople and Alexandria, the same creatures appeared again and again, the same lions, the same pelicans, the same basilisks, and, rendered with quiet authority on page after page, century after century, the same vast shape, dark beneath anchored ships, with fires burning innocently on its back. The Aspidochelone did not survive 1,000 years by accident. It survived because it was useful, and understanding why it was useful to the people who preserved it tells us something profound, not only about the creature, but about the entire world those people inhabited. To understand the beast's preservation, we must first understand the book that carried it. The Physiologus, the text we encountered in our opening, was not simply a book of natural history. That description, while accurate on the surface, undersells what it actually was. The Physiologus was, in the truest sense of the phrase, a book of the world. It operated on the premise, absolutely sincere, absolutely central to the intellectual life of late antiquity, that every creature God had placed in nature was there for a reason, not merely a biological reason, a moral reason, a theological reason. The natural world, in this understanding, was a kind of second scripture. If the Bible told you what to believe, the behavior of animals told you how to live. The pelican, which was believed to pierce its own breast to feed its young with its blood, became an image of Christ's sacrifice. The eagle, which was said to fly toward the sun until its old feathers burned away and new ones grew in their place, became a symbol of spiritual renewal. The phoenix, the unicorn, the salamander, each carried a lesson as specific and intentional as any verse in the Psalms. The natural world, properly read, was a continuous sermon. The Aspidochelone fits seamlessly into this schema. Its lesson was clear. It represented deception. It represented the danger of mistaking comfort for safety, of trusting surfaces, of anchoring yourself to something that seemed solid and discovering too late that it was hollow, or worse, actively hostile, beneath, in a theological framework already deeply preoccupied with the nature of the devil. This was an extraordinarily valuable image. The early Christian writers who worked with the Physiologus used the creature explicitly as an allegory for Satan. Beautiful, patient, impassive on the surface, and utterly lethal underneath. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. They were not using the creature as a vague metaphor. They were quite direct. The beast was the devil. The sailors who came ashore were sinners deceived by the pleasures of the world. The fire they lit, the comfort they sought, was the warmth of earthly satisfaction, and the sinking, that was damnation, sudden, final, complete. This was not a subtle message, but subtlety was not always the point. The physiologus spread from Alexandria in the 2nd and 3rd centuries outward through the known world with a speed remarkable for its era. It was translated first into Latin, then into Syriac, Armenian, Ethiopic, Arabic, Old English, Old High German, Icelandic, and dozens of other languages, until it had reached virtually every literate community in the medieval world. No two translations were identical. Scribes added animals, removed others, expanded the allegorical commentary, shortened it, adjusted the theology to suit their regional church traditions. The Aspidochelone appears in most of these versions, though it wears different names depending on where and when the text was copied. In some manuscripts, it is the Aspidochelone. In others, the asp turtle, the great fish, the sea monster. In still others, it carries no name at all, only a description so vivid and so consistent that its identity is never in doubt. What this tells us is that the creature was not simply copied passively from one manuscript to the next. It was chosen over and over again by scribes who had the option to omit it and did not. It survived not because it was inert, but because it resonated. It kept being useful. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the physiologus tradition had given birth to an entirely new genre of text, the bestiary. The bestiaries were, in the broadest sense, expansions of the physiologus, encyclopedic collections of animals, real and imaginary, each accompanied by natural description, moral commentary, and, crucially, illustration. It is in the bestiaries that the Aspidochelone truly comes alive for modern eyes, because the bestiaries were illustrated with extraordinary care. The Aberdeen bestiary, produced in England around the year 1200 and now held at the University of Aberdeen, is perhaps the finest surviving example of the form. It is a manuscript of profound beauty, its colors still vivid after 8 centuries, its illustrations executed with a confidence and precision that speaks to long tradition and genuine artistic skill. On one of its pages, rendered in the deep blues and greens of a medieval sea, the creature appears exactly as the text describes it, enormous, low in the water, its back dotted with vegetation, 3 ships anchored against its side. On the back, small figures tend small fires. The creature's expression, if a creature of that scale can be said to have one, is utterly unreadable, impassive, patient, waiting. What strikes any viewer who spends time with that illustration is its matter-of-factness. The illuminator was not trying to produce horror. The image is not sensational. It is presented with the same calm authority as the illustration of the elephant on the following page or the eagle on the page before. The creature is simply there, in the world, doing what it does. The terror is structural, not stylistic. It is built into the situation, not performed in the rendering. This is, when you think about it, exactly how the most effective warnings work. They do not shout. The monasteries that produced these manuscripts were not isolated from the wider world. Monks traveled, merchants traveled, pilgrims traveled. The bestiaries moved along the same routes as the trade goods, the relics, the correspondence, the ideas that knit medieval Europe together into something recognizable as a civilization. A monk in Canterbury might have access to a copy of a bestiary produced in Burgundy. A scholar in Cologne might study a manuscript that had passed through the hands of readers in Toledo and Rome before reaching him. The Aspidochelone moved with all of this, carried in leather satchels and wooden chests, packed into the holds of ships with the wool and the spices, copied and recopied in the candle-lit rooms of institutions whose names we still recognize today. And as it moved, it gathered. New details accrued, regional variations developed. The basic image remained stable. The enormous creature, the deceived sailors, the fire, the descent. But the texture around it shifted depending on who was handling it. In some Northern European versions, the creature began to absorb characteristics from Norse sea monster traditions. In Middle Eastern and Persian retellings, it acquired a more explicitly philosophical cast, less a moral warning than a meditation on the nature of appearances and reality. In each case, the creature was not merely received, it was interpreted, worked on, made to carry whatever weight the new cultural context needed it to carry. This is one of the things that separates the Aspidochelone from the dozens of other fabulous creatures that populated medieval bestiaries and then faded from cultural memory. The bonacon, that flatulent ox-like beast, whose chemical defenses were both impressive and absurd, is today known only to specialists. The Catabalpass, the Yale, the Amphisbaena. They appear in their manuscripts and largely disappear from the living tradition. But the great sea creature endured because its central image was too resonant, too flexible, too applicable to the universal human experience of mistaken trust and unexpected catastrophe to be left behind. There is one more thing worth noting about the world in which these manuscripts were produced, because it bears directly on how we should understand the creature itself. The monks and scholars who wrote about the Aspidochelone did not, in most cases, believe they were writing fiction. They were working within an intellectual tradition that did not draw a clean line between the known and the unknown, between what had been observed and what had been reliably reported. The sea was vast. It was genuinely, practically vast in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from the vantage point of a world mapped from orbit. The edges of the medieval world's known geography were genuinely uncertain, genuinely permeable to possibility. A creature large enough to be mistaken for an island was extraordinary, yes, but the sea was full of extraordinary things. Men who had sailed long distances came back with stories. Those stories were taken seriously, evaluated, recorded. When a scribe in a 12th century English monastery wrote down the description of the Aspidochelone, he was not necessarily writing a fairy tale. He may well have been writing natural history, imperfect, second-hand, filtered through allegory and theology, but sincerely intended as a record of something real that existed somewhere out in the waters beyond the edge of the familiar world. That sincerity matters. It changes the texture of everything. These were not people writing about a creature they knew to be impossible. They were people writing about a creature they had no particular reason to rule out, in a world where the sea had not yet been fully explored, in a tradition that regarded all of creation as meaningful and purposeful and worthy of careful record. The Aspidochelone, to them, was not a metaphor that happened to take animal form. It was an animal that happened to carry a metaphor beautifully. The distinction is subtle, but it is, perhaps, the most important distinction of all. There is a particular quality to the fear that lives at sea. It is not the sharp electric fear of sudden danger, the kind that moves through you in an instant and is gone. It is slower than that. It is the fear that accumulates over days and weeks of open water, when the horizon is identical in every direction, and the sky above is the only thing you can be certain of. It is the fear of not knowing what is beneath you, of understanding, in the most visceral and immediate sense, that you are floating on a surface, and that the surface is thin, and that what lies below it is essentially without limit. Sailors, across every culture and every era of seafaring history, have understood this in their bones, and it has shaped the way they told stories. The creatures that populate maritime mythology are not arbitrary. They are precise. They map, with uncanny accuracy, onto the specific texture of the fears that the sea produces. The kraken emerges from directly below, from the unseen deep, from the water beneath your keel. The sea serpent appears at the horizon. at the threshold between the known and the unknown, and the Aspidochelone, or its many regional cousins and counterparts, haunts the moment of false safety, the moment when you think you have found rest, the moment when you drop your guard. That is not a creature born in a monastery. That is a creature born on the water. The monks preserved it and gave it theological weight. But someone, long before Alexandria, long before the physiologus, long before any of the careful scholarly traditions that carried the image across centuries, someone first dreamed it up at sea. And to understand the creature fully, we have to go back to that water. The Norse seafaring tradition is, in many respects, the richest and most elaborated maritime culture the medieval world produced. The Norse sailed farther, more consistently, and with a greater degree of systematic exploration than virtually any other people of their era. They reached Iceland and Greenland and the eastern coast of North America. They navigated the river systems of Russia and Ukraine all the way to the Black Sea. They traded with Byzantium, raided the coasts of England and France, settled the North Atlantic island chains, and produced in the process a body of seafaring law that is extraordinarily detailed in its attention to the specific, practical realities of ocean travel. Within that tradition, there exists a creature called the Hafguffa. The name translates, roughly, as sea mist or sea steamer, a reference to the vaporous exhalations the creature was said to produce, which could be mistaken for fog on the surface of the water. It appears in the Konungs Skuggsjar, the King's Mirror, a Norwegian didactic text from around the year 1250, presented as a dialogue between a father and son, in which the father explains the wonders and dangers of the known world. The Hafguffa is described there with a directness and a specificity that is striking even now. The text tells us that there are 2 of these creatures in all the seas of the world. Only 2, ever, because their reproductive rate is so slow that if more of them existed, they would devour everything in the ocean. It tells us that the creature surfaces and expels a belch of regurgitated matter, fish, seaweed, the digested contents of its vast stomach, and that other fish, attracted by this abundance, swarm around its open mouth. The Hafguffa then closes its jaws and sinks, and the fish are gone. It is a precise and almost clinical description. The creature does not attack. It does not pursue. It simply creates conditions that are indistinguishable from natural abundance, and then consumes everything that responds to that abundance. The mechanism of deception is ecological rather than geographic, but the structure of the thing, the false offering, the fatal response, the catastrophic revelation of what was actually happening, is identical to the structure of the Aspidochelone. What is remarkable about the Konungs Skuggsjar description is the tone. The father presenting this information to the son is not performing horror. He is not relishing the strangeness of it. He is matter-of-fact, practical, instructional, in the same register he might use to explain the currents around a particular headland or the best approach to a harbor in poor visibility. The Hafguffa is a hazard, a known hazard with documented behavior that a competent sailor should understand and prepare for. This is the voice of a tradition that has processed the creature into something functional, something you warn your children about, something you include in the curriculum. The Örvar, Odds Saga, one of the Icelandic Fornaldarsoga, the sagas of ancient times, gives us another encounter with what is almost certainly the same creature, though here named differently and encountered in different circumstances. The hero Örvar, Odda and his companion Börvar Bjarki sail across a dark sea and encounter an island where they attempt to make camp. The island, as you have already guessed, is not an island. The saga's treatment of the moment of revelation is worth attending to carefully, because it differs in one crucial respect from the physiologus account. In the Norse version, the sailors survive, or at least some of them do. The hero escapes. The creature, having surfaced and begun to move, does not pursue. This is a meaningful divergence. The Christian allegorical tradition required the sailors to die because the lesson required completion. The wages of temptation are destruction, but the Norse heroic tradition operated by different rules. In the sagas, the point of a monster encounter is frequently not the monster's victory, but the hero's response to it. The creature is there to test, to reveal character, to produce the specific pressure under which extraordinary people demonstrate their extraordinariness. A half-guffer that kills everyone is simply a catastrophe. A half-guffer that you survive by being quick, skilled, and clear-headed is a story worth telling. The same creature, two entirely different moral architectures built around it. This divergence becomes even more interesting when we follow the creature into the Arabic tradition, which preserved and transformed the Aspidochelone along an independent trajectory that ran parallel to both the monastic European and the Norse maritime traditions. The 1001 Nights account of Sinbad's first voyage is the most famous version, but it is far from the only one. The Arabic literary tradition was itself drawing on earlier Persian and Indian maritime narratives when it assembled the Sinbad cycle, and those earlier narratives contain their own versions of the island creature. The Ajaib al-Makhlukat, the wonders of creation, composed by the Persian cosmographer Zakaria ibn Muhammad al-Qazwini in the 13th century, describes a creature of the ocean called the Zaratan, a word of Persian origin meaning something close to old tortoise. The Zaratan is enormous. Plants grow on its back. Ships anchor against its sides. The description is so close to the Aspidochelone of the physiologus that the relationship between the two is unmistakable, though the direction of influence, which tradition borrowed from which, and when, and through what intermediaries, remains a subject of genuine scholarly debate. What the Arabic and Persian tradition adds to the creature that neither the monastic European nor the Norse tradition emphasized is this: a quality of antiquity. The Zaratan, in several of the accounts that describe it, is not simply large. It is ancient beyond comprehension. It has been in the ocean so long that the landscape on its back has developed over geological time. Trees have grown and died and grown again on its shell. Whole ecosystems have established themselves in the geography of its body without the creature ever having moved enough to disturb them. The creature does not move because it does not need to. It has been where it is for longer than anyone can measure, and everything comes to it in time. This is a genuinely different kind of terrifying. The Norse half-guffer is dangerous because of what it does. Its active mechanism of deception, its patient biological trap. The Christian Aspidochelone is dangerous because of what it represents, the devil's eternal readiness to offer comfort as a prelude to destruction. But the Zaratan is terrifying because of what it is. Something so old that it has become geology. Something so patient that time itself moves differently around it. Something that has watched the entire human enterprise of seafaring from its position of absolute stillness, and has simply waited for whatever comes to it. There is a philosophical tradition in the Islamic world that was deeply interested in the question of what existed before human consciousness and what would exist after it, and the Zaratan sits within that tradition as a kind of living illustration. It is not hostile. It is not even, in any meaningful sense, aware. It simply is, and that passivity, that vast, ancient, indifferent being there, is in its own way more unsettling than active menace. Back in the waters of northern Europe, in the same centuries that al-Qazwini was describing the Zaratan, something else was happening to the maritime tradition of sea monsters. The creature was beginning to appear on maps. Medieval and early modern cartography had a complex relationship with the unknown. The areas beyond the edges of reliable geographic knowledge were not left blank. They were filled with decorative sea creatures, with stylized waves, with warnings, with the creatures that sailors had reported or imagined or feared. The famous instruction, Hic sunt dracones, "Here be dragons" appears on only one surviving medieval map, the Lennox Globe from around 1510. But the practice of populating the unknown margins with monsters was widespread, and among those monsters, appearing with notable consistency in the waters of the far north and the open Atlantic, are shapes that are clearly cousins of the Aspidochelone, vast, low in the water, occasionally with what appear to be structures or vegetation on their backs. The Carta Marina, the great map of Scandinavia produced by Olaus Magnus in 5039, is the most elaborate surviving example of this tradition. It is packed with sea creatures of every description, each labeled and described in the accompanying text, each positioned in the waters where sailors had reportedly encountered them. The creatures on the Carta Marina are not purely decorative. Olaus Magnus was a serious geographer and historian. He collected accounts. He interviewed sailors. He was trying, within the limits of his era's methodology, to produce an accurate record of what existed in the waters of the northern world. Among the creatures on the Carta Marina, there is one that is described as lying so still in the water that it is covered with sand and rocks and appears to be part of the ocean floor. Ships have apparently anchored against it, in the account Olaus Magnus received, and been dragged down when it moved. The mechanism is slightly different. It is the seafloor now, not an island, but the fundamental image is unchanged. The surface that seems stable is alive underneath. The place where you thought you were safe is the most dangerous place of all. What we see when we lay all of these traditions beside one another, the monastery and the saga, the Persian cosmography and the Scandinavian map, is not a case of simple borrowing. It is something more interesting than that. It is a case of independent convergence. Different cultures, working with the real experience of the sea, kept arriving at the same essential image, because the sea really is vast and dark and full of things that are larger than human beings can easily accommodate. Because ships really are small. Because the surface of the water really does conceal more than it reveals. Because the history of seafaring really is full of moments where what appeared to be safety turned out, with brutal efficiency, to be its opposite. The Aspidochelone did not survive because it was copied from one text to another, though it was. It survived because the fear that produced it was real and renewable and portable across any ocean on Earth. Every sailor who looked at calm water and felt, for just a moment, uncertain about what lay beneath it, was looking at the same thing those ancient storytellers were looking at. They just didn't always have a name for it. There is a moment in the history of every idea when someone, somewhere, decides to ask whether it is true, not whether it is useful, not whether it is beautiful or instructive or morally improving, whether it is, in the plainest and most demanding sense of the word, accurate, whether the thing described actually exists in the world in the way it has been described, whether the accounts can be trusted, the sources evaluated, the claims tested against something harder than tradition and more rigorous than faith. This moment, and it is never a single moment, of course, but a slow and contested and frequently reversible process, arrived for the bestiary tradition somewhere in the 12th and 13th centuries, as the great universities of Europe began to consolidate around a new intellectual project, the systematic, rational examination of the natural world. It did not go smoothly. It rarely does. And the Aspidochelone, with its characteristic stubbornness, refused to go quietly into the category of things that educated people no longer believed. To understand what happened, we need to understand what the universities were and what they were trying to do. The great medieval universities, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, Salamanca, were not simply places where the existing stock of knowledge was transmitted from one generation to the next, though they were certainly that. They were institutions engaged in a genuine, ambitious, and sometimes dangerous project of intellectual synthesis. The project was this: to take the recovered texts of ancient Greek philosophy, above all Aristotle, whose works had been preserved in Arabic translation and were now flowing back into Western Europe through the scholarly centers of Toledo and Sicily, and reconcile them with the theological framework of Christian doctrine, to make Aristotle and the Church agree with one another, or at least to find ways of making them coexist. This was a project with enormous implications for the natural world, because Aristotle was, among many other things, a biologist. He had spent years observing marine life in the waters around Lesbos. He had dissected animals with systematic patience. He had produced, in his Historia Animalium and the related zoological texts, the most careful and empirically grounded account of the natural world that antiquity had managed. And Aristotle's natural world was substantially different from the natural world of the physiologus. It was not a world of moral lessons dressed in animal form. It was a world of causes, mechanisms, functions. A world where the interesting question about an animal was not what it taught you about virtue or sin, but how its body worked and why. When Aristotelian natural philosophy arrived in the universities of medieval Europe, it created pressure, not immediately. The process was gradual, and the authorities of the Church were watching carefully for anything that looked like heresy, but steadily and irresistibly. The scholars who worked within this new framework began to look at the bestiaries with different eyes. They began to ask different questions, and the questions were uncomfortable. Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, the Dominican friar and encyclopedist who taught at Cologne and Paris in the mid-13th century, is perhaps the clearest example of what this new intellectual pressure produced. Albertus was not an anti-religious man. He was, by any measure, a profoundly devout one. He became a bishop. He was eventually canonized. He was one of the most influential theologians of his era, and he was also, simultaneously, the most rigorous natural philosopher the medieval West had yet produced. A man who believed that the proper study of God's creation required the same careful, systematic, empirical attention that Aristotle had brought to it, because to understand creation was to honor the Creator. Albertus worked through the bestiary traditions systematically, and his method was, in its quiet way, revolutionary. For each creature he asked, what is the actual evidence for this? What sources describe it? And how reliable are those sources? Does the natural behavior attributed to the animal make sense, given what we know about biology? Does the animal have the physical characteristics necessary to do what it is said to do? By these standards, many bestiary creatures fared poorly. The barnacle goose, widely believed in the medieval tradition to hatch from barnacles attached to driftwood, which conveniently meant it could be eaten on Fridays as a fish rather than a bird, received Albertus's pointed skepticism. He had not observed this. He did not find the accounts credible. He said so directly. The manticore, the bonnecan, several others. He treated them with a careful reserve that was, in context, an implicit rejection. But Albertus did not dismiss everything. And here is where the story becomes interesting. Large sea creatures, genuinely large ones, he took seriously. And he was right to, because the ocean in the 13th century was still producing reports of things that had not been fully explained. Whales were known, but poorly understood. The full range of deep-sea life was not remotely catalogued. The boundaries between the plausibly real and the certainly fantastical were genuinely unclear in marine biology, in a way that they were not on land, where most of the large animals had been observed and described and were relatively well understood. The Aspidochelone, when it reached Albertus's desk, embedded in the physiologus tradition, weighted with centuries of allegorical commentary, presented a specific problem. Its allegorical function was theologically impeccable. Its moral lesson was sound. But was it real? Could something exist that was large enough to be mistaken for an island? Albertus was cautious. He did not affirm the creature in the full terms of the physiologus, but he did not dismiss the possibility of enormous sea creatures entirely. He noted, correctly, that the deep ocean was poorly known, that reliable accounts of large marine animals existed, and that the absence of direct observation was not, in itself, proof of absence. He was, in this, operating within the best available epistemology of his moment. He was being careful. He was being honest about the limits of what could be known. It was a more sophisticated response than simple belief. It was also a more sophisticated response than simple dismissal. And it is, perhaps, a more intellectually respectable position than either of those would have been. Roger Bacon, the English Franciscan friar, who was working in the same era as Albertus, and is often cited as one of the earliest advocates for something like experimental science in the Western tradition, took a related but slightly different approach to the problem of fabulous beasts. Bacon was deeply interested in the question of how knowledge was acquired and what made a source trustworthy. He distinguished, with unusual clarity for his time, between things that had been directly observed, things that had been reported by reliable witnesses, things that had been transmitted through a long chain of secondary sources, and things that were simply invented. He applied these distinctions to natural philosophy with a rigor that was, in his context, startling. Bacon did not spend significant time on the Aspidochelone specifically, but his framework had profound implications for the bestiary tradition as a whole. By his standards, most of what the bestiaries contained was third or fourth hand at best. Reports of reports of reports transmitted across centuries and languages and cultural contexts, with no clear chain of observational evidence behind them. The pelican piercing its breast was not something anyone had witnessed. The phoenix was not something anyone had found, and a creature large enough to be mistaken for an island was, by any honest assessment of the available evidence, something no one in the scholarly community could claim to have personally verified. What Bacon's framework produced was not a clean dismissal of unverified creatures, but something subtler, a gradation of confidence. Some things were known, some things were reported, some things were speculated, and some things were simply traditional, preserved not because they were true, but because they were old, and because questioning old things was uncomfortable, and because the institutions that preserved old things were powerful. The bestiaries sat uncomfortably across several of these categories at once. They contained genuine observation. Anyone who had actually watched a pelican knew something about pelicans, whatever embroideries had been added to the account. They contained reliable report. Traders and sailors described real animals from distant regions imperfectly but recognizably, and they contained pure tradition. Creatures that existed only in text, sustained only by repetition, with no observational anchor of any kind. The Aspidochelone was in the third category, and increasingly, as the 13th century gave way to the 14th and the 15th, as the universities consolidated, as the tools of natural philosophy sharpened, as the methodological pressure for evidence intensified, the creatures in that third category began to face a kind of quiet, uncomfortable scrutiny they had not faced before. And yet, there is a figure in this story who complicates the tidy narrative of reason gradually displacing myth, and that figure is Vincent of Beauvais. Vincent was a Dominican friar working in France in the mid-13th century, a contemporary, roughly, of both Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon, and he produced one of the most ambitious encyclopedic projects of the entire medieval period, the Speculum Maius, the Great Mirror, a vast compilation of everything known or believed about the natural world, history, theology, and doctrine. It ran to millions of words. It took decades to produce, and in its section on natural history, the Speculum Naturale, Vincent included the Aspidochelone, Not with skepticism, not with caveats, with the same calm encyclopedic authority with which he included the elephant and the lion and the whale. Vincent was not an anti-intellectual. He was deeply engaged with Aristotle. He knew the new natural philosophy. He made sophisticated distinctions elsewhere in the speculum between reported and observed knowledge. But he also understood that his encyclopedia had a different function than a treatise in natural philosophy. It was not a record of what had been verified. It was a record of what was known, in the broadest possible sense of that word, including what had been transmitted, what was traditional, what carried cultural and theological authority. The Aspidochelone carried all of those things. To omit it would have been to produce an incomplete account of the world as the intellectual tradition understood it. Vincent's decision is revealing because it shows us something important about the medieval scholarly mind that the modern tendency to frame this period as simply pre-scientific tends to miss. These were not people who were incapable of critical thought. They were people operating within a more complex understanding of what knowledge was for. Knowledge was not only descriptive, it was not only an account of the world as it materially existed, it was also normative, traditional, theological. It included things that were true in ways that transcended material existence. The Aspidochelone was true in all of those ways, even if, it turned out that no specific creature exactly matching its description had ever physically surfaced and drowned a crew. This is not a comfortable position for a modern reader. We tend to divide things cleanly, true or false, real or fictional, observed or invented. The medieval scholarly tradition operated with a more porous set of categories. And perhaps here is the uncomfortable possibility that the creature keeps quietly raising across all of its many contexts. Perhaps the clean division is not always as clarifying as we think it is. A creature that has taught the same lesson reliably for 1500 years, that has structured the same warning in a form that travels across languages and cultures and centuries without losing its essential shape. Is that creature entirely without reality? Is the thing it describes entirely absent from the world? Deception does not require a tortoise the size of an island. It only requires something that looks like safety and is not. It only requires the human willingness to anchor against the first solid-looking thing after a long time adrift, and to light a fire, and to stop asking questions about what is underneath. That creature is everywhere. The scholars could question the shell. They could not question what lived inside it. There is a particular kind of loss that arrives not with catastrophe but with knowledge. It is slow. It is almost imperceptible as it happens. And it is, in many ways, harder to grieve than the losses that arrive suddenly, because it is accompanied by triumph, by the flags planted, the distances measured, the routes established, the coastlines finally committed to paper with the authority of direct observation. The age of exploration was, by any honest accounting, one of the most consequential periods in human history. It remade the world. It connected continents that had developed in isolation for tens of thousands of years. It redistributed populations, languages, crops, diseases, animals, and ideas on a scale that has no precedent before it, and perhaps no parallel after. It was extraordinary. It was brutal. And quietly in the margins of all that noise and violence and transformation, it did something else. It killed the Aspidochelone. Or rather, it tried to, and the trying tells us as much as anything else in this long, strange history about what the creature actually was, and what it was doing, and why it has never quite managed to stay dead. The process began, in earnest, in the 15th century, with the Portuguese. Prince Henry of Portugal, known to later history as Henry the Navigator, though he himself almost never sailed, established at Sagres, on the southwestern tip of Portugal, something that functioned as the world's first dedicated institution of geographic research. He gathered cartographers, astronomers, mathematicians, and sea captains. He collected accounts of the African coastline from Arab traders and Malian merchants. He commissioned voyages, funded the construction of new ship designs better suited to open ocean sailing, and systematically pushed Portuguese knowledge of the world's coastline southward, year by year, decade by decade, past the limits of what any previous European mariner had reached. This was a new kind of enterprise. The medieval voyages, the Norse crossings of the North Atlantic, the occasional Venetian or Genoese venture into the eastern Mediterranean, had been driven largely by trade or by personal ambition or by the accidents of storm and current. Henry's project was driven by something different, the deliberate, institutional accumulation of geographic knowledge, the explicit goal of knowing, of filling in the map, and filling in the map was, necessarily, an act of displacement. Every coastline precisely charted was a coastline from which the sea monsters could be evicted. Every island positively identified as rock and vegetation and soil, as genuinely, verifiably geologically inert Earth, was an island that could no longer harbor the possibility of the Aspidochelone. The creature needed the blank spaces. It lived in the margins. And the age of exploration was, above all else, a sustained assault on the margins. By the time Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1497 and opened the sea route to India, the coastline of Africa had been mapped with reasonable accuracy from its northern shores to its southern tip. By the time Magellan's expedition completed the first circumnavigation of the globe in 1522, Magellan himself dying in the Philippines, the voyage completed by the Basque navigator Juan Sebastián Elcano, the basic shape of the world was understood, not the details, not the interior of continents, not the full extent of the Pacific island chains, not the polar regions, not the deep ocean floor, but the shape, the outline, the fact of the thing. This was an epistemological event of the first order. It meant that the ocean, for the first time in human history, had edges that were known. It had a size that could be estimated. It had routes through it that had been sailed and measured and survived. The category of unknown ocean did not vanish. There were still vast stretches of the Pacific that no European ship had crossed, still the entire Southern Ocean, still the Arctic waters, but its character changed. It was no longer boundless and beyond reckoning. It was large but finite, terrifying in many ways still, but bounded in a new sense. You could know where the danger was, in a way that you could not before. For the Aspidochelone, this was a problem, a structural problem. The creature's power had always depended, in part, on the legitimacy of the unknown. As long as the sea contained regions that no reliable European observer had crossed, as long as there were blank spaces on the map that could honestly and genuinely harbor anything, the creature had a home. It could be out there. It could be in the spaces beyond the edge of what was drawn. But as those spaces were filled, one by one, with the careful lines of cartographers working from the accounts of actual voyages, the creature's address kept changing, and the neighborhood kept shrinking. What is fascinating, and what prevents this from being a simple story of enlightenment erasing superstition, is the way the navigators themselves responded to the creatures. They did not abandon them, not immediately, not cleanly. The sailors of the age of exploration were, in many cases, deeply superstitious men operating in an extremely dangerous profession with very limited ability to predict or control the conditions of their work. A sailor in the 16th century who crossed the Atlantic faced mortality rates that, by modern standards, are almost incomprehensible. Storms, disease, navigational error, hostile encounters, structural failure. The sea remained lethal in ways that no amount of improved cartography could fully mitigate. The emotional need for the creatures did not evaporate simply because the intellectual framework that housed them was under pressure. So what happened instead was adaptation. The creatures shifted. They retreated from the coastlines that had been mapped and congregated in the unmapped interiors of the remaining blank spaces. They moved to the deep ocean, to the abyssal zones that no one had yet reached, that would not be reached in any meaningful sense until the 19th century's oceanographic expeditions. They acquired new names, new characteristics, new details borrowed from the genuinely strange marine life that the voyagers of exploration were bringing back to European awareness for the first time. The giant squid, the oarfish, the whale shark, creatures whose actual existence was strange enough to sustain the imaginative infrastructure of the old monster tradition. The sea serpent survived longest and most robustly in this adaptation because it was the most flexible. A large, elongated, unknown creature in the water could be almost anything, and as long as large, unknown creatures in the water could not be entirely ruled out, the sea serpent had a foothold in the plausible. The kraken survived because the deep ocean was genuinely uncharted and would remain so for centuries. But the Aspidochelone, the island that was alive, the creature that depended on a specific geography of deception, the beast that needed the open, unknown ocean in which to place a convincing false landmass, the Aspidochelone had a harder time of it, because islands, as it turned out, could be counted. And by the 17th century, a great many of them had been. There is a document that illuminates this transition with unusual clarity, though it is not usually read in the context of creature mythology. It is the Mundus Novus, the New World. The published account, circulated in 1503, of Amerigo Vespucci's voyages to the South American coast. Vespucci's text is partly navigational, partly ethnographic, and partly, in a quiet way, polemic. He was arguing against a tradition that wanted to interpret the lands Columbus had reached as the eastern edge of Asia, that what lay across the Atlantic was something genuinely new, not the world the old maps described, not the world the old texts anticipated, something that the entire inherited tradition had not seen coming. Vespucci was not a natural philosopher in the Albertus Magnus mold. He was a practical man, a merchant mariner, with a practical man's impatience for theories that did not match what he had observed with his own eyes. And what he had observed was a continent, an enormous, densely populated, biologically extraordinary continent that no bestiary had mentioned, no classical source had anticipated, no medieval encyclopedist had included in their account of the world. The natural world of the Americas was full of creatures that made the Aspidochelone look conservative by comparison. Jaguars and tapirs and anacondas and hummingbirds and creatures so far outside the European imaginative framework that the early natural historians of the New World spent decades simply trying to find vocabulary adequate to describe them. This had a paradoxical effect on the monster tradition. On one hand, the existence of a genuinely unknown continent, a continent containing genuinely unknown creatures, temporarily reinvigorated the possibility of fabulous beasts in the popular imagination. If you had been wrong about the world being fully known before, perhaps you were still wrong in ways you had not yet discovered. The blank spaces had not vanished, they had simply moved. Perhaps the Aspidochelone was out there still, in some unexplored bay of the South American coast, or in the vast Pacific that lay beyond it. On the other hand, the methodology that was filling in those new blank spaces, direct observation, systematic record, the accumulation of empirical evidence by trained observers, was precisely the methodology that was most hostile to creatures whose existence rested on tradition rather than testimony. The naturalists who sailed with the great voyages of exploration were not monks with an allegorical framework to maintain. They were men with notebooks looking at what was actually there. By the late 16th century, the creature had begun, in the scholarly literature, to shift registers. It was no longer primarily a natural history claim. It was becoming something else, something harder to categorize and, in its own way, more durable. The Flemish cartographer Abraham Ortelius, who produced the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, the theatre of the world, in 1570, the first true modern atlas, included sea creatures on his maps in the old tradition, but where earlier cartographers had placed them with a degree of geographic specificity, in particular waters, near particular coasts, Ortelius placed them more decoratively, more self-consciously. They were still there, but the relationship between the image and the claim had changed. The creatures on Ortelius's maps were acknowledging, in their visual register, that they were as much artistic convention as empirical assertion. They were present the way heraldic animals are present, not because anyone believes lions have two faces or dragons breathe fire, but because the image carries meaning that transcends its literal content. The Aspidochelone, in other words, was becoming a symbol, consciously, deliberately. The scholars and cartographers who handled it in the late 16th and 17th centuries were aware, in a way their medieval predecessors had not quite been, that they were working with a tradition rather than a fact, and they chose to preserve the tradition, not out of ignorance, out of understanding, because the thing the creature stood for, the deception of surfaces, the danger of false rest, the catastrophic revelation of what lies beneath the thing you trusted, was not a thing that geographical knowledge could make obsolete. You could chart every island in the ocean. You still could not chart every surface that was not what it appeared to be. There is one final act in the age of exploration's encounter with the creature, and it is the strangest and in many ways the most revealing. In 1620, the same year the Mayflower crossed the Atlantic, the same year Francis Bacon published the Novum Organum, his foundational text for what would become the scientific method. A Jesuit priest named Athanasius Kircher was beginning the intellectual career that would eventually produce, among dozens of other extraordinary works, the Mundus Subterraneus, the underground world. His encyclopedic account of the interior of the earth and its relationship to the ocean. Kircher was a man of enormous learning and boundless curiosity, simultaneously one of the last great Renaissance polymaths, and one of the first modern scientists, depending on which part of his work you examine. Kircher believed in the Aspidochelone, or at least, and the distinction matters, he believed in the category of creature it represented. He was aware that the specific image of a turtle, large enough to be mistaken for an island, was difficult to verify. He was also convinced, from his extensive study of ocean currents and submarine geology, that the deep ocean contained living things of a scale and character that had not yet been directly observed. He treated the creature, in his writing, as a placeholder, as the name the tradition had given to a category of genuine possibility that had not yet been filled by observed fact. This is, arguably, the most sophisticated position anyone had taken on the Aspidochelone in the 15 centuries since the physiologists first set it down. Not credulous, not dismissive, genuinely, carefully agnostic. The creature might be exactly what the tradition said it was, or it might be something else, something real, but different in its particulars from the inherited description. Or it might be purely allegorical, but the allegorical content was real regardless, and the genuine uncertainty about the deep ocean was real regardless, and so the creature retained its place, not in the bestiary tradition which was by then substantially exhausted, but in the larger conversation about what the world contained and what remained to be found in it. That conversation was just beginning, and the Aspidochelone, having survived the monasteries, the universities, and the age of exploration, prepared to make its most unexpected journey yet into the modern imagination, where it would find not a smaller world to inhabit, but in many strange ways, a larger one. The maps got finished, not all at once. The deep ocean floor was not meaningfully charted until the mid-20th century. And even now there are trenches and abyssal plains that have been measured, but never seen by human eyes. But the surface of the world, the coastlines and islands, and the broad geography of the sea, was essentially complete by the early 19th century. The blank spaces were gone. The margins were filled. Every significant island on the planet had been located, named, administered, and recorded by at least one colonial power with a cartographic tradition. There was, in the strictest geographic sense, nowhere left for the Aspidochelone to hide. And something remarkable happened. It stopped hiding. It went somewhere else entirely. And in doing so, it demonstrated a quality that the best ideas always demonstrate when the world tries to make them obsolete. It turned out that the idea was never really about the thing it appeared to be about. The creature was never really about the ocean. The ocean was simply where people went when they needed to think about the unknown. When the ocean was charted, the unknown moved, and the creature moved with it. Herman Melville understood this in the way that the great novelists understand things, not through argument, but through image, through the accumulation of specific embodied detail that suddenly, in retrospect, adds up to something larger than itself. Moby Dick, published in 1851, is the last great work of the maritime monster tradition, and it is aware of its own lateness. Ishmael, the narrator, is a man who knows the ocean is being demystified around him, who knows that whaling is an industry, systematic and commercial, not an adventure in the old heroic sense, and who goes to sea anyway, looking for something the industry cannot account for. The white whale is not the Aspidochelone, but it carries the same essential structure, a vast thing in the water that is not what it appears to be, that offers the illusion of knowability. Ahab believes he knows it, believes he can find it, believes he understands what it is, and that reveals, at the moment of final contact, that it was never available to be known in the way he thought it was. The ocean swallows everything. The surface closes. Ishmael alone survives. The creature had moved from natural history into literature, and in literature, it was no longer constrained by the question of whether it existed. It existed the way all the best literary creatures exist, with a truth that has nothing to do with zoology. Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine writer, whose imagination was so thoroughly saturated in medieval bestiary tradition that he eventually produced his own encyclopedia of fabulous animals, included the Aspidochelone. He used the Latin spelling. In the Book of Imaginary Beings, the catalogue of mythological creatures he compiled with Margarita Guerrero and published in its final form in 1967, Borges treated it with the characteristic precision and slight distance of a man who loved these creatures too much to be naive about them. He gave the creature's history accurately and concisely. He noted its theological function. He did not argue for or against its literal existence. He simply placed it in its tradition and let it stand. But the introduction to the Book of Imaginary Beings contains a passage that speaks, more eloquently than anything else written in the 20th century, to the question of what these creatures are and why they persist. Borges wrote that a zoology of imaginary animals was, in some sense, more revealing than a zoology of real ones, because imaginary animals are pure products of the human mind, undistorted by the accidents of evolution, free to embody exactly and only what the people who made them needed them to embody. They are, he suggested, a kind of self-portrait, a record of what humanity has feared and longed for and tried to warn itself about across the whole span of its imaginative life. The Aspidochelone, read this way, is one of the most persistent and telling entries in that self-portrait. It has appeared in every era, in every tradition that encountered the sea seriously, in every culture that built ships and loaded them with people and sent them out into the unknown. It has worn different names and different theological costumes and different narrative shapes. But the core of it, the thing that generates the image, has never changed. It is the fear of misplaced trust, the fear of the solid ground that moves, the fear of having committed yourself fully and finally to something that was never what you believed it to be. This is not a maritime fear. It never was. The ocean was simply the best available metaphor for the conditions under which that fear operates. Conditions of limited visibility, of dependence on judgment that cannot be fully verified, of irreversibility once the anchor is dropped and the fire is lit. The sea made the image vivid, but the fear belongs to everyone who has ever trusted something and been wrong, which is, in the end, everyone. The creature appears in modern literature and film and folklore in forms that are rarely labeled with its ancient name, but are recognizable the moment you know what to look for. The island that turns out to be alive. That specific image runs through 20th century fantasy and science fiction with a consistency that mirrors its medieval persistence. It appears in the fiction of C.S. Lewis, in Tolkien's Legendarium, in the ocean mythology of Ursula K. Le Guin. It surfaces in transmuted form, in the genre of cosmic horror that H.P. Lovecraft established, where the fundamental terror is not a monster in the conventional sense, but the revelation that what you took to be the stable background of the world is itself alive, itself aware, and profoundly indifferent to your presence on its surface. The sleeping Rye rising from the Pacific is, structurally, the Aspidochelone, the ground that moves, the island that was never an island. The image keeps returning because the experience it encodes keeps recurring. We build on surfaces we have not examined. We anchor against things we have not verified. We light our fires in places we have chosen for their apparent stability, and we call it home, and we stop asking questions. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a feature of being human. The necessary willingness to commit, to settle, to trust, without the complete information that perfect certainty would require. But the Aspidochelone has been whispering the same warning across 15 centuries for exactly this reason. Commit if you must. But look first. Ask what is beneath the thing you are standing on, because the surface that seems most solid is sometimes the one that is about to move. There is a final image I want to leave you with. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, in the waters between Iceland and the Faroe Islands, there is a phenomenon that oceanographers call a whale footprint. When a large whale dives from the surface, it leaves behind a circular patch of unnaturally smooth water, caused by the turbulence of its descent, spreading upward and flattening the chop. It can persist for several minutes after the animal has gone. To a sailor in a small boat in poor visibility, that circle of smooth water looks, for a moment, like a clearing, like a calm place, like somewhere to rest. And then the swell moves through it, and it is gone, and the ocean is identical in every direction again, and there is no sign of what passed beneath. The Aspidochelone has not gone anywhere. It simply became too large in the end to see all at once. It became the whole ocean. It became every surface we inhabit without fully understanding. It became the ground beneath our certainties, patient, deep, indifferent, and occasionally, without warning, prone to move. The sailors who named it are long dead. The monks who illuminated it in their careful manuscripts are long dead. The scholars who debated it, the navigators who charted around it, the poets who turned it into literature, all long dead. The island waits. It has always been very good at waiting.